Hello and welcome to F360, Indiana Folklore and Folk Life. In this lecture, we continue our conversation about the concept of folklore. Last lecture, we labored over its history and the question of who are the folk. In today's lecture, we continue our probing of the word folklore, this time foregrounding the lore. Just as American folklorists changed their scholarly focus by redefining the folk, the lore, or the stuff of folklore, has gone through various understandings since the founding of the field. As noted in our last lecture, when the American Folklore Society was founded in 1888, they thought the lore was fast vanishing, something that literacy, industry, and urbanization would eventually destroy. Some combed the countryside for the remains of the traditional stories, songs, proverbs, rhymes, and superstitions. For them, the lore was primarily oral, setting it in contrast to print sources. Other scholars were also concerned with the music, crafts, dance, agricultural practices, and other customary traditions that modernity was seen as threatening in folk society. Each of these categories are a kind of lore, or genre of folklore, that folklorists documented, organized, and analyzed. Most of the scholars were interested in rendering the fleeting moments of storytelling into texts, which is what the Grimms had done in compiling their books of fairy tales and legends. Other folklore scholars centered their research on the traditional songs of the folk. Francis James Child brought attention to ballads, which is a special term for narrative songs. He researched, collected, and organized 305 ballads that he felt made up the core collection of ballads from England and Scotland, and their American variants, of course. His published collection filled 10 hefty volumes. Much of the research of these early scholars was to compare and contrast versions, which gave rise to a research technique known as the historic geographic method, which was developed by Finnish folklorist Julius Krohn. This scientific method mapped the types and motifs of stories, hoping to find clues to the origins of these stories. This method waned in the mid-20th century because it failed to prove much about the ancestry of narratives. Recently, however, in our new era of big data and informatics, it has gained new currency, now using these traditional narratives to address questions about social history. While many early folklorists thought of lore as various kinds of oral traditions, others documented the customary and material expressive practices of the folk. Festivals, crafts, architecture, and things that didn't pass orally, but rather were transmitted through example or by observation. Nevertheless, folklorists worked to translate the ephemeral stories and cultural practices into text and illustrations. For many, these texts were the thing. It was the lore. However, when folklorists following Dundas' lead saw everyone as folk and with folklore, then it couldn't be quickly passing away as they had once thought. It became emergent and dynamic. A group of scholars, referred to at the time as contextualists, shifted the meaning of lore from text to a kind of action or performance, a communicative act, which led to a new definition of folklore, offered by Dan Benamos, who called it artistic communication in small groups. I'll say that again. You'll want to remember it. Artistic communication in small groups. Of course, the small groups comes from Dundas' notion of folk groups, but Benamos focused on the creative and communicative conduct in these little communities. In the next several mini-lectures, I'll explore some common genres in oral narratives, first focusing primarily on the text, and then turning our attention toward the context and texture of folklore.